They buried him in silence, not beneath stone, but beneath centuries of ritual erasure. Whole dynasties once whispered his name, then later scratched it from temple walls. He was once the divine protector of Ra, the one who stood at the prow of the sunboat and stabbed chaos in the eye. But then almost overnight, he became the villain. A god of storms, a murderer, a monster. They say he killed Osiris. They say he laughed while Egypt bled. But what if they were wrong? Set, the god of chaos and desert, was not the threat, but the warning. Of course, stories like that don't just vanish. They simmer. They drift in forgotten incense and echo through cracked stone halls. So take a breath. Let the noise fade. There's something waiting in the sand, and it's older than any myth we still tell. You're standing at the edge of the western desert. It's just before dawn, and the air hasn't decided whether it's cold or hot. The horizon lies flat like a long-held breath. Somewhere out there, beneath layers of drifted earth and time, lies the last temple of a god Egypt tried to forget. His statues once stood taller than men. His name once meant protection, justice, strength. But then came the smear campaigns, the demon masks, the stories that made children shiver. They didn't just kill his worship, they rewrote his purpose. The god of foreigners, storms, chaos. He became the embodiment of disorder itself. But was that the truth? Or was it the neat, politically convenient version of history, sculpted by pharaohs who feared something older than they could control? Tonight, we're not retelling myths. We're peeling them open. Each chapter will take you deeper into forgotten tombs, forbidden rituals, and the curious places where divinity and danger overlap. And at the heart of it all, a single question. Why did Egypt bury Set, and what did they fear he would reveal if they didn't? Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. Long before Set was feared, long before he wore the horns of a demon or was blamed for fratricide, he was something else entirely. His earliest forms rise from the mists of pre-dynastic Egypt, when gods weren't yet gods in the polished, priest-approved sense, but were instead forces raw, wild, and necessary. Set in those dim and formative centuries was not the villain. He was the storm that brought change, the desert that protected, the chaos that cleansed, and he was revered for it. Back then, Egypt wasn't even Egypt. It was a stretch of fertile basins and competing tribal territories scattered like pearls along the Nile's edge. The desert wasn't an enemy. It was a boundary, a defense, a crucible. And Set, the god of red sand, of foreign winds, of thunder without rain, emerged not as a destroyer, but as a force to be respected. In some of the oldest artistic depictions, he stands upright and proud, wearing the strange, unidentifiable animal head now called the Set animal. It's not a dog, it's not a jackal. It doesn't match anything in Egypt's natural world. And maybe that was the point, because in a world where Horus was the hawk, Ra the sun, and Sobek the crocodile, Set was something different, alien, untamable, and above all necessary. A protective force in a brutal land. Tribes in Upper Egypt once called on Set during warfare, invoking his energy to gain strength and cunning. In some versions of the oldest coronation rites, the pharaoh claimed dominion not only by channeling Horus, but by balancing him with Set. Duality was not the enemy, it was the foundation. Later scribes, perhaps embarrassed by this, tried to explain it away. They softened the records, reshaped the myths, and made Set's role in royal iconography seem like a tolerated nuisance rather than a partner. But the artifacts tell a different story. Carvings in early Naqada pottery depict Set with honor, not revulsion. His animal totem appears beside those of other major gods, not beneath them. And in Ombos, his cult center in Upper Egypt, temples to Set predate some of the oldest known shrines to Horus. If one god was the sky, the other was the storm. They weren't enemies, they were balance. But then came the dynasties. Power consolidated, the priesthoods organized, and suddenly the gods who had once been fluid and overlapping were forced into rigid hierarchies. Horus, the son of Osiris, became the living god-king. Ra became the absolute. Ma'at, the principle of cosmic order, became law. And Set, well, Set didn't quite fit anymore. His wilderness didn't obey. His chaos didn't submit. And in a society that now prized control, predictability, and lineage, Set's refusal to play by the rules made him dangerous. Still, they couldn't erase him. Not yet. His association with the desert and the foreign remained too useful. Egypt's enemies came from the Red Lands, from the west, the south, the east, and so Set became the god who dealt with outsiders. He became their bridge, their buffer. Soldiers called to him in battle. Travelers prayed to him at border stones. Even the sun god Ra, in his nightly journey through the underworld, relied on Set to defeat the serpent Apophis. It was Set who stood at the prow of the boat, spear in hand, while the others cowered. Order depended on chaos knowing its place, but that uneasy reverence came at a cost. As foreign threats grew, so did suspicion. Set was no longer just the desert guardian. He was the foreigner, the other, the unclean. A god once native became a god rebranded exotic, dangerous, suspicious. One priestly commentary from the Middle Kingdom refers to him as "he who roars in the tempest," a phrase that was once a compliment, now laced with unease. And as the myths began to crystallize into dogma, Set found himself cast in darker roles. Modern Egyptologists have puzzled over this transition. Why would a god so essential to early power structures fall so thoroughly from grace? Some suggest it was simply political expediency. Others point to shifting economic centers where Set's cults fell out of favor. But a more intriguing possibility lies in the roots of Set's identity. He was never easily tamed. And perhaps in a system built on hierarchy and control, that alone was his unforgivable sin. One particularly obscure theory, still debated in academic circles, suggests that Set's original worship may have predated even the unification of Egypt, that his cult was the dominant force in parts of Upper Egypt that were later absorbed by Horus-worshipping regions. If true, it means Set's demonization wasn't just mythological, it was political conquest disguised as theology. His myths rewritten by the victors. This idea remains controversial. There's little direct evidence, just a trail of fragmented clues, early symbols scratched on forgotten steles, inconsistent genealogies in temple records, strange absences where one might expect prominence. But for those who believe it, the implications are stark. Set wasn't turned into a villain because he killed Osiris. He was turned into a villain because he lost. And that sets the tone for everything that followed. The next time we encounter Set prominently in history, he's no longer a protector. He's a problem, a threat, a god who dares to exist outside the palace walls. And Egypt, ever the master of reinvention, begins preparing the ultimate character assassination. You've heard the story before, at least the one that made it through the centuries. Osiris, beloved king and bringer of civilization, is murdered by his jealous brother Set, who then dismembers his body and scatters the pieces across Egypt. Isis, Osiris's devoted wife, gathers the fragments, reassembles her husband, and miraculously conceives Horus, who grows up to avenge his father and banish Set. It reads like a myth of good versus evil, light versus dark, a morality tale written in stone. But stories are not stone, they're clay. And Egypt, with its endless dynastic turns, knew how to shape clay. In the earliest texts, this famous narrative doesn't quite exist. The pyramid texts, our most ancient religious records, speak of Osiris, and they mention Set, but not yet with the clear antagonism of later centuries. In fact, some fragments hint at a more complex relationship, even partnership between the two. There are moments where Set helps Osiris ascend, moments where the murder is symbolic, not literal, and moments when Set appears not as an enemy, but as a vital part of a cosmic cycle, a necessary shadow for rebirth to occur. Strange, then, that this nuance all but vanishes in later mythology. What shifted scholars have traced a slow narrative hardening during the first intermediate period. As Egypt fractured politically, so too did its theology. Regional cults began consolidating their stories, their rituals, their hierarchies. And by the time of the Middle Kingdom, the Osiris myth was crystallizing into something cleaner, more dramatic. A murder, a resurrection, a son's revenge. It had the shape of justice, of divine retribution, of order triumphing over chaos. And crucially, it gave Set a perfect role villain. There's a practicality in myth-making. Stories don't just explain the world, they reinforce who should rule it. And in a kingdom that now viewed the pharaoh as Horus, incarnate, what better justification for divine kingship than a tale where Horus defeats chaos itself? Set, by contrast, became the cosmic criminal, the prototype of rebellion. His fall from ambiguous force to narrative scapegoat wasn't just religious. It was political theater. But traces of the old Set still flicker beneath the surface. In some versions of the conflict between Horus and Set, the gods do not agree on a clear winner. In the contendings of Horus and Set, an elaborate story found in a New Kingdom papyrus, the gods deliberate bicker and hesitate. At one point, Set even seduces Horus in an attempt to shame him, an act interpreted by many scholars as not only mythic humiliation, but an echo of older power games. The gods hesitate. The judgment is delayed. It's not a clear-cut victory for Horus, and Set is never truly destroyed, only pushed aside. Curiously, in this same story, Set is once again praised for his strength, especially his protection of Ra on the solar bark. Even as villain, he's still essential. Egypt, it seems, couldn't fully get rid of him. And maybe that was the point. You need your scapegoat to stick around. After all, someone has to absorb the chaos. But there's a darker layer here. A subtle erasure happening between the lines. For while Osiris is sanctified and Set vilified, there's little said about how much this story changed over time. Modern Egyptology has noticed that the myth's sudden centrality during the Middle and New Kingdoms coincides with increased centralization of power. The myth may have been emphasized, some say invented not for religious reasons but to serve a particular regime's political needs. After all, what better way to justify a ruler's divine right than by evoking a family drama where the bad brother is cast out forever? One obscure theory nestled in a dusty 20th century dissertation suggests the myth of Set murdering Osiris may have retroactively mirrored actual dynastic betrayal. A real royal fratricide long buried in records could have been mythologized into theological law. It's a stretch, but not an unreasonable one. The Egyptian elite were nothing if not masters of narrative control. And a murder myth retold as sacred truth would have been a powerful tool to both sanctify one bloodline and tarnish another. This theory is, of course, unproven, but it opens a question that lingers like desert heat. Was Set demonized because he committed the crime, or because someone needed him to be guilty? A god once portrayed with nuance, even reverence, became the singular villain of Egypt's spiritual drama, and it's not hard to imagine the priesthoods leaning into it. Fear is easy to preach. The image of a brother turned murderer of chaos, devouring order from within, is sticky. It travels well across generations. You don't need footnotes to feel the threat. And so Set's myth calcified, taught to children, carved into walls, baked into funerary rites. He wasn't just the murderer of Osiris. He became the threat to all things sacred. But this too leaves us with unease. If Set was once a protector, if his fall was political rather than divine, then what does that make Osiris? And what does that make the empire built on that blood-soaked myth? These questions linger as we turn toward the Hyksos period, a time when foreign kings ruled Egypt, and Set curiously found himself rising once again. The god who murdered a king was about to wear a crown. It begins with a riddle that Egypt still refuses to answer. Why, at the very moment Egypt was overrun by foreign rulers, did Set, exiled, vilified, and disgraced, suddenly rise again in royal favor? The Hyksos, a Semitic-speaking people from the Near East, swept into the Nile Delta around 1650 BCE, bringing with them new weapons, new trade networks, and most controversially, new gods. But instead of imposing a completely foreign pantheon on their adopted land, the Hyksos did something far more subtle. They adopted Set. Not as an outsider, not as a lesser god, but as their own patron deity. They weren't alone in this. The city of Avaris, their capital in the north, was practically a shrine to Set. Excavations reveal temples, statues, and offerings all directed to the once disgraced desert god. This wasn't reluctant tolerance. It was enthusiastic embrace. For the first time in generations, Set's name was spoken with reverence inside royal halls. At first glance, it seems like political theater. The Hyksos were, after all, foreigners, and Set, already associated with deserts and outsiders, made for a convenient divine ally. By championing the god of foreign winds and chaotic strength, the Hyksos aligned themselves with a symbol Egyptians already feared. The Red Desert, the eastern winds, the unclean lands beyond the Nile. Set was all of these, and now so were they. But the relationship ran deeper than symbolism. There are records from this period, fragmented, yes, but telling, that suggest Set was more than a mascot. He became a theological tool for legitimizing rule, a force that transcended the conventional boundaries of Ma'at, the divine order. Set, the breaker of rules, was now the maker of new ones. Some historians have noted the architectural flourish in Setian temples during this time. Gone were the cautious peripheral shrines. In Avaris, Set's temples stood tall, bold, filled with images not of a defeated villain, but of a victorious war god. One relief shows him with a mace raised high, trampling crocodiles and foreign beasts alike. A perfect god for kings who saw themselves not as caretakers, but conquerors. This troubled the traditional priesthoods badly. In Thebes, far to the south, Horus and Osiris remained supreme. There, the memory of Set was still one of betrayal and murder. The idea that a foreign dynasty would exalt him as kingmaker wasn't just offensive, it was dangerous. It was theological treason. The backlash was slow at first. Whispers, edicts, a quiet rewriting of religious texts to minimize Set's victories. But once the native Egyptian kings of Thebes began pushing north, reclaiming land, unifying factions, and finally ousting the Hyksos, the reaction became swift and severe. Set was purged, his temples dismantled, his cults disbanded. His name in some places was chiseled out. What had briefly been a renaissance became a second damnation. This time, Set's guilt was not just mythic, it was historical. He had stood with the invaders, and Egypt, proud of its reclaimed sovereignty, would not forget. But here's the twist. Even after the Hyksos were gone, and Thebes stood triumphant, traces of Set refused to disappear. In the Ramesside period, the great age of warrior pharaohs like Seti I and Ramesses II, Set once again slipped into favor. Carefully, quietly, but undeniably. Seti's very name means he of Set. Ramesses II named his father Seti as well, and both kings continued to honor Set alongside the more dominant gods. They built temples where Set stood beside Horus, not beneath him. Why perhaps they couldn't ignore what Set represented: victory, strength, the ability to survive the desert and crush foreign enemies. The very traits Egypt needed as it expanded into Asia and repelled new waves of invaders. In a cruel twist, Set, the god once banished for siding with the Hyksos, became the god who helped defeat their spiritual heirs. But the scars remained. Set's association with the Hyksos never fully healed. Later, pharaohs grew cautious again. The priesthoods reasserted control, and Set once more was nudged to the margins. There's an obscure inscription, faint, nearly erased, on a boundary stone in the eastern delta. It speaks of Set not as enemy or ally, but as the bridge between lands. A god who understood both Egypt and the world beyond. Neither fully trusted nor entirely exiled, always hovering at the edge of power. Modern scholars still debate the Hyksos-Set alliance. Some believe it was purely political theater. Others argue for a genuine theological shift, with the Hyksos introducing Set as a synthesis of their own desert deities and the Egyptian pantheon. But there is no consensus. The evidence is too fragmented. Too many questions remain buried beneath temples toppled by nationalist fervor. What's certain is this Set's adoption by the Hyksos changed him forever. It locked him into a role he would never fully escape: the god of foreigners, the traitor, the outsider. It didn't matter that he was Egyptian-born, that he had protected Ra-guided kings and once stood at the heart of Upper Egypt's oldest cults. After the Hyksos, Set would always be the god who crossed the border. And borders, as Egypt understood well, are meant to be guarded, not worshipped. Still, something about Set's resilience gnawed at the edges of power. They tried to bury him again, but he would not stay gone. Because chaos, even when erased from the walls, has a way of whispering back through the cracks. And next, we'll follow one of those cracks to a strange and disturbing fusion between Set and Egypt's oldest enemy, the chaos serpent itself. There's a scene that plays out every night in the Egyptian sky. The sun, swallowed by darkness, descends into the underworld, and there, floating in the celestial river, Ra must battle Apophis, the chaos serpent, to be reborn by dawn. For centuries, it was Set who stood at Ra's side during this perilous journey. Spear in hand, muscles taut, he guarded the solar bark against the serpent's coils. He was the only god strong enough, ferocious enough to face chaos itself and not flinch. And yet, by the later dynasties, something disturbing happened. The line between Set and the serpent began to blur. Apophis, or Apep, as some texts name him, was never a god. He was uncreation incarnate, a churning void that hated life, light, and law. No temples were ever raised in his honor. He had no priesthood. To be associated with Apophis was to be associated with annihilation, and yet Set, who had once been Apophis's greatest foe, was eventually described in certain hymns as storming like the serpent. The chaos he once fought had, in the eyes of many Egyptians, begun to look like him. At first, it seems like a mistake, a scribal confusion. But the deeper you look, the more intentional it feels. Some scholars believe this conflation was seeded during the backlash against Set's Hyksos revival. If the foreign kings were now the enemies of Egypt and Set had been their patron, then he must have shared in their sin. And what better way to emphasize his betrayal than to associate him with Apophis, the one thing even the gods feared? Over time, this fusion calcified. Set was no longer just the murderer of Osiris or the god of deserts. He was like Apep. And that single phrase restructured his myth forever. But the relationship wasn't always hostile. In one controversial passage from the Book of the Heavenly Cow, Set is described as being given to Ra as a son to help carry him through the underworld. In another, he is honored as the only god capable of slaying the serpent every night. The roles flip, dance, blur. One moment he is the loyal defender of light. The next he howls in the dark beside the enemy. There's something uncomfortable about that ambiguity. Egyptian religion thrived on duality, life and death, order and chaos, light and shadow. But it preferred its boundaries stable. Set increasingly refused to stay in place. And perhaps that was the problem. He did not represent chaos in the way Apophis did, blind, devouring, eternal. Set represented conscious chaos, calculated rebellion, the kind that disrupts not from outside but from within. That distinction terrified the priesthood. There's an obscure spell in the coffin texts that scholars often overlook. It warns against a serpent in the shape of a man who whispers false truths in twilight. The name is never given. The lines are fractured. But it appears in a context where Set is invoked only a few stanzas later. Coincidence, perhaps. But in a religion where every symbol carried weight, every placement meant something, and every silence could shout, the proximity matters. And yet, even in the midst of this theological degradation, Set remained indispensable. Night after night, the solar drama continued. Apophis rose. The world threatened to end, and Set blade gleaming struck. They couldn't get rid of him. They needed his strength even as they recoiled from what it might mean. The modern reader might ask, why not choose a different hero, Horus, Thoth? Even Anubis, weren't they worthy warriors, but none of them embodied the kind of ruthless, raw power required to face the void. Only Set. Because only chaos could conquer chaos. This contradiction led to awkward theological workarounds. In some versions of the myth, Set becomes possessed by the serpent's rage. His loyalty questioned, his presence on the bark framed as dangerous. In others, he is omitted, entirely replaced by nameless forces of light. But the older versions lingered. The ones etched into temple walls. The ones where Set does not betray the gods, he saves them. It's this tension that still puzzles scholars. If Set was truly Apophis, why let him guard the sun? If he wasn't, why did later myths push him toward that role? A few bold Egyptologists argue that this entire confusion was deliberate, a kind of spiritual misdirection. By casting Set as Apophis, the priesthood could neuter his remaining cults. Worshipping Set became suspect. The line between prayer and blasphemy became razor thin, and over time his temples grew quieter. Still, a few Setian cults resisted. In remote desert outposts, rituals honoring Set continued long after his fall from grace. Some even embraced the Apophis connection, reframing it not as evil, but as transformation. They believed Set was not corrupted by the serpent, but had absorbed it. That he had learned to master the darkness. To wield it, not succumb to it. These fringe sects never reached prominence. Most were erased or absorbed. But their existence hints at a deeper mystery. Perhaps Set's identification with Apophis wasn't a fall. It was an evolution. The official records don't support that view, of course. The The priesthoods preferred a simpler story. Set betrayed Ra, Set became Apophis. End of tale. But even within that narrative, the edges fray. Because every morning, the sun still rose. And deep in the mythic hours of night, Set still stood, watching the shadows for the shape of the serpent. And next, we'll turn from myth to temple stone. Because if Set was so reviled, why were his priesthoods so fiercely defended and so violently destroyed? There is a quiet danger in gods who refuse to vanish. Egypt's official doctrine tried again and again to cast Set into exile, and yet his name lingered, not only among desert nomads or foreign kings, but inside Egypt's own walls, hidden behind temple doors, whispered between generations. While the great cities sang of Osiris and Horus, a different kind of prayer echoed in shadows, prayers to the god of storms, red earth, and righteous fury. Set was not only feared, he was still worshipped. The records are scarce and not by accident. Most surviving references to Setian priesthoods are fragmented, damaged, or curiously vague. Names scratched out, rituals left incomplete. But what does survive tells a tale of devotion far deeper than simple rebellion. There were temples, modest but sturdy, built in the borderlands and desert fringes where Set reigned not as a villain but as protector. And these weren't the desperate cults of outlaws. They were organized, literate, and richly supplied. In the town of Sepermeru, nestled on the edge of the Fayum, a temple to Set once stood tall. Archaeological fragments reveal elaborate offerings, incense, beer, fine linen. Set shared this space with Nephthys, his divine partner, in a union that some scribes carefully avoided discussing. But it was there in papyri and temple graffiti that the god was called Set, the strong lord of power, avenger of wrongs. Not a monster, not a murderer, a judge. Even more curiously, in the Ramesside period, several high officials bore names invoking Set, Seti, Setemheb, even princes with titles like Beloved of Set. One would expect such names to vanish in times of political caution, and yet they multiplied. These weren't criminals, they were royal, which suggests that even amid Set's public decline, private veneration thrived. That duality unsettled the elite. A god who lives both in condemnation and admiration is not easy to control. And the priesthoods knew it. Temple inscriptions from other regions subtly mocked Set's followers, portraying them as misguided or dangerous. In Memphis, a hymn to Horus includes a strange line: "He who walks the desert path wears the mask of Set." It sounds like metaphor, until you realize it's also warning. The suppression wasn't swift, it was surgical. Certain temples were quietly closed. Festivals were rebranded. Scrolls referencing Setian rituals were recopied without his name. The Set animal once proudly displayed on temple banners became less defined, more abstract. Artists blurred its features. Eventually, it became little more than a symbol of the other. A god unmade by omission. But it didn't end there. In the early Third Intermediate period, a series of curious temple purges swept through Upper Egypt. Officials with Setian names were stripped of titles, their statues defaced. In Sepermeru, the Great Set Temple was methodically dismantled, its stones carted off and reused elsewhere. The god's image was not just erased, it was repurposed, embedded in structures now dedicated to his rivals. Why the violence? That's the question Egyptologists still debate. One camp argues it was religious hygiene, the kingdom purging remnants of its most controversial deity. Another more intriguing theory suggests fear, not of Set as a myth, but of Set as memory. These temples may have protected something older than scripture, rituals and doctrines that contradicted the state's carefully managed theology. One recovered scroll fragment heavily damaged hints at a Setian rite involving the weighing of hearts, not against Maat's feather, but against flame. Another references a Red Book of Kings, a lineage unrecognized by mainstream records. It's tantalizing, but incomplete. The scrolls disintegrate just when the language becomes specific. Convenient, some might say, but the open question remains: did Set's cult preserve a vision of the cosmos that rivaled Egypt's mainstream Order One, where chaos was not evil but sacred, where judgment came not from balance but force? It's worth noting that during these purges, the cult of Osiris grew exponentially. New festivals elaborate funerary rites, increasing references to the afterlife as a mirror of Osiris's journey. In contrast, Set's theology was earthbound, brutal, present. His followers did not promise paradise. They promised justice. One small temple in Karga Oasis, likely built by desert nomads, featured a statue of Set, painted not in black or red, but in shimmering gold. No inscriptions survive, only the base to he who strikes first. An odd title, un-Egyptian in tone, and entirely unlike the quiet grace of Osiris's epitaphs. Was this fear what drove the priesthoods to extinguish the Setian flame? Or was it something older, a rivalry of worldviews that predated dynasties, a war between desert and river instinct and order force and patience? Whatever the truth, the erasure was never complete. As with every attempt to bury Set, fragments remained, scratched into pottery, muted in tomb murals, echoed in names long after they were no longer safe to speak aloud. And next we'll meet a heretic pharaoh who perhaps knowingly resurrected a forgotten theology. One that fractured Egypt's religious core and may have drawn its inspiration not from the sun, but from the storm. He was called the heretic king, the one who dared to rewrite heaven. Akhenaten-born Amenhotep IV ascended the throne with all the usual trappings of pharaonic power, divine lineage, priestly support, a pantheon of gods at his back. And yet within a few short years, he shattered that world. He abandoned the old gods, closed the temples, and declared Aten, the sun disk, as the one true divine force. Not Ra in his usual form, not the hidden Amun, just Aten radiating light, faceless, featureless, absolute. At first glance, it seems Akhenaten's rebellion had nothing to do with Set. After all, Set was still a cursed figure in most public texts by this time. The temples of Horus and Osiris had long since cast him into the shadows. And Aten, the light without form, seemed the antithesis of Set's raw, storm-laced power. But the deeper you look, the more unsettling the echoes become. Akhenaten didn't just reject the gods, he rejected divine stability itself. He uprooted centuries of ritual order. The daily rhythms of prayer, offering, and rebirth were abandoned. He closed temples not just to Amun, but to Thoth, Ptah, even Osiris. The entire scaffolding of Maat, the sacred balance that held Egypt together, was pulled apart. And that is where Set's influence begins to whisper. Set was never about balance. He was strength, disruption, violent clarity. He didn't protect the cosmic order by standing within it, but by standing apart from it, like a watchman on the edge of chaos. In many ways, Akhenaten adopted the same posture. He didn't reform the priesthoods, he removed them. He didn't correct the mythic narrative, he erased it. He, like Set, became the storm against the sky. There's no record of Akhenaten publicly worshipping Set. That much is true. But records from his reign are incomplete by design. His city, Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna, was a deliberate blank slate, a world built to ignore the past. Yet even here, strange coincidences linger. Several statues recovered from Amarna depict the royal family not with traditional grace, but in poses of exaggerated, almost grotesque intimacy. Distorted proportions, soft flesh, long heads, eyes stretched wide as if to see beyond. It echoes the otherness of Set's image, a god always rendered with features unlike anything in nature. And then there's the matter of the winds. Akhenaten's hymns to Aten speak not only of light, but of breath-harsh, dry desert air that fills the lungs with life. In one passage, the Aten is praised for stirring the red winds of the horizon. It's an odd phrase. Red winds were traditionally associated with Set, who ruled over the desert and brought the burning storms from the west. Was this an accident of poetry or a veiled invocation? A few rogue scholars believe Akhenaten's entire revolution wasn't so much a solar cult as a return to a suppressed theology, one rooted not in Aten alone, but in Setian ideas. Not the god himself, perhaps, but the ethos, the break from order, the distrust of priestly control, the exaltation of unseen force over anthropomorphic deity. Akhenaten in this reading didn't worship Set, but he acted like him. This would explain why, after his death, Egypt reacted with such fury. His name was erased, his monuments smashed, his capital city abandoned stone by stone. It was more than rejection, it was exorcism, as if a disease had to be carved from the flesh of the nation. And yet, some of Akhenaten's ideas survived. In private tombs near Thebes built decades after his reign, prayers to Aten appear quietly, cautiously. In others, Set's name returns carved in hidden places. One priest entombed during the reign of Ramesses II carries both symbols, Aten's sun disk above and the Set animal scratched beneath his feet. Impossible to say what he believed, but the contradiction is telling. Perhaps that's the real legacy of Set, not as a name, but as a force. A god who lives not in temples, but in revolutions. When systems break, when power shudders, when theology burns down to its foundation, Set waits there, not to rule, not to restore, but to remind. And Akhenaten, for all his luminous rhetoric, was not a restorer. He was a breaker. Like Set, he knew that sometimes what lies beyond the border is more honest than the city it surrounds. The question remains, was Akhenaten merely mad, a religious fanatic blinded by sunlight? Or was he the last pharaoh to truly glimpse the forgotten fire at the core of Egypt's oldest god? Either way, his fall was absolute, but his shockwaves were not. In the silence after his reign, as Egypt struggled to restore its shattered image of divine order, something began to stir far from the Nile, in the desert itself. A new excavation, an unearthed temple, a trace of Set in the sands. And next, we follow that trail into forgotten tombs, where rituals once outlawed flicker faintly in the red dust. There are places in Egypt the guides don't mention. No glossy brochures, no friendly signs. Just heat, wind, and silence. In the far reaches of the western desert, beyond the cultivated Nile Valley, lie ridges of sunburnt rock where time itself seems exhausted. And there, among the dunes that shift and whisper, archaeologists have begun to find something strange. Tombs, shrines, altars, not dedicated to Ra or Osiris or the usual gods of Egypt's glittering pantheon, but to Set, not the demon Set, not the murderous brother, but the older one, the warden of boundaries, the one who stood alone in the sand and called the winds by name. The discoveries began modestly, a fragment of pottery here, a curious glyph there. But over time, a pattern emerged. The tombs are small, shallow, and half-consumed by the desert. Their walls are rough, their decorations minimal, and yet what they do include tells a strikingly different story. In one tomb near Dakhla, a figure is carved with upraised arms, flanked not by Anubis or Isis, but by what appears to be a stylized Set animal, elongated snout, squared ears, tail erect. Not in chains, not crushed, but radiant, honored. This has baffled archaeologists. The tomb is dated to the early Site period, well after Set's demonization had become canon. By this time, temples had all but stopped invoking him. His name was absent from official inscriptions. And yet here, far from the Nile's watchful gaze, someone still prayed to him. Someone still built a resting place in his name. In another dig closer to the Karga oasis, researchers uncovered a sandstone altar etched with spiral motifs and strange cartouches that mixed traditional Egyptian hieroglyphs with unidentified characters. At its base, a red pigment had stained the stone, a residue that under analysis revealed traces of cinnabar and animal fat. Ritual materials, offerings. Someone had fed this altar, fed it recently in relative terms. The desert preserves what the Nile swallows. What does it mean? One possibility advanced by fringe researchers and cautiously echoed by a handful of mainstream scholars is that a splinter cult of Set continued in secret long after his official downfall. These worshippers didn't simply remember the god as he once was, they believed he still held power. Not as chaos incarnate, but as an intermediary. A god who ruled the places the others feared. Where Osiris ruled the tomb, Set ruled the horizon. Where Horus guarded the sky, Set stood in the gap between dusk and night. This belief may not have been heresy. It may have been memory. Several of the tombs share unusual features, doorways that face due west, uncommon in traditional Egyptian mortuary architecture. Symbols of coiled rope, often associated with boundaries and imprisonment, appear alongside depictions of open gates. One mural, half lost to erosion, shows a figure stepping out of the red desert into a green field, his path guided by two animals, one clearly a jackal, the other ambiguous. Set, animal, wolf, spirit, guide. The image resists classification. What strikes researchers most is the care. These were not hastily dug graves. They were deliberate, planned, and they cluster in areas once known for caravan traffic places, where merchants and nomads might have whispered their own prayers into the wind. Set as god of the borderlands would have been a fitting guardian for those who lived between worlds. One scholar, Dr. Iman Saleh, suggests that these cults represent not resistance but refuge. That Set offered an identity for people who found themselves pushed outside the dominant systems, foreigners, traders, outcasts. In Set, they found not condemnation, but kinship. But that interpretation has critics. Others argue these tombs reflect not genuine belief, but a syncretic mishmash of symbols. They point to the inconsistent inscriptions, the non-standard burial practices, the lack of centralized temple infrastructure. These weren't priests, they argue, just desert eccentrics, misfits playing with forbidden iconography. Nothing more. Still, the question hangs like heat shimmer: why, after centuries of theological suppression, did these symbols return? And why here it may come down to one simple truth: the desert forgets nothing. In its silence, old names linger. Where papyrus decays and cities fall, the sand holds its secrets. And Set, god of sand and silence, may have simply waited longer than the others. One final discovery unsettles even the most cautious minds. A buried stone stela recently uncovered near Bir Tawil bears an inscription that, while partial, includes the phrase, "To he who knows the red path." The rest is worn away. But the title is unique. It does not appear in any known liturgical text. Some interpret it as metaphor. Others believe it was a title used only in this shadow cult, an acknowledgement of Set not as adversary, but as guide. And guide he did. From here we follow him one last time, not into myth, not into tombs, but into interpretation. Because if Set was not evil, if his demonization was built atop political sand, then what did he truly represent? And why was that so dangerous? Now step back, peel away the layers, let the myths dissolve into dust. What if everything Egypt told you about Set, everything etched in stone and inked on scrolls, wasn't about evil at all? What if it was about fear? Not fear of darkness or of murder or even of chaos, but fear of what chaos reveals. Because Set didn't threaten Egypt with destruction. He threatened it with truth. Throughout this long journey, you've seen Set shift from honored guardian to cosmic criminal, from royal ally to spiritual exile. But his essence never truly changed. He remained the same God who stood in the margins, who wielded disruption not to destroy, but to transform. And it's that transformation, unpredictable, uncontrolled, uncomfortable, that Egypt's rulers could not tolerate. You see, Egypt loved order. Mayat wasn't just philosophy, it was political structure, spiritual law, agricultural rhythm, everything in its place. The sun rising on time, the Nile flooding on cue, but Set didn't belong to systems. He embodied rupture. He was the thunderclap in a clear sky, the storm that forced crops to bend the wind that erased a caravan's trail. He was not evil. He was inconvenient. That's what made him dangerous. Recasting Set as evil was a defense mechanism. By making him the villain, Egypt protected its narrative. It simplified the cosmos into digestible opposites, good and bad light, and dark Horus and Set. But the truth was always more tangled. The earliest myths didn't pit Horus against Set, they entwined them. The balance of kingship depended on both. Horus brought vision. Set brought strength. Together they made the two lands whole. Even later, when Set was vilified, Egypt couldn't entirely cut him loose. They still needed him at the edge of the solar bark, still needed his spear to pierce the serpent. Because chaos isn't always destruction. Sometimes it's defense. The kind of chaos that breaks stagnation, that clears dead branches, that protects by refusing to be predictable. In this way, Set becomes more than a figure of fear. He becomes a metaphor for power that doesn't ask permission. That may be why Set's followers in their scattered, wind-scoured tombs clung to him long after the priesthoods moved on. They saw in him not a monster, but a mirror. A reminder that to live outside the system doesn't mean you are wrong. It means you are watching from a different angle. And sometimes that's the only place from which the whole picture makes sense. There's a modern tendency to associate chaos with evil. But in Egypt, chaos Isfet was more complex. It wasn't malevolent, it was simply unruled. Ma'at was not moral perfection, it was balance. And balance only exists in contrast. If Horus stood for harmony, Set stood for honesty, the kind that burns through illusions and exposes what control tries to hide. Which brings us to the open wound of the Osiris myth. Set killed his brother, yes, but perhaps that myth, stripped of its polish, tells a different tale. Perhaps Osiris wasn't just the victim. Perhaps Set didn't just strike out in envy. Perhaps it was about power succession cycles of change. The breaking of old forms to allow something new. Set, after all, did not kill life. He forced it to evolve. One damaged text recovered from a ruined temple in the Sinai offers a cryptic line: "He is not the chaos. He is the gate." It's written in archaic glyphs, scratched hastily, perhaps even forbidden at the time. But it holds a different vision of Set, not as enemy, but as threshold. Not as poison, but as medicine. Bitter, hard to swallow, but cleansing. It's a notion that persists quietly even today. In modern occultism, Set has re-emerged not as a demon, but as a symbol of personal transformation, a god of will, of clarity born through challenge. The Set of today wears many faces, but underneath them all, he remains the question Egypt never answered. What happens when the system no longer serves the truth? Because if Set was never evil, if his story was rewritten to protect power, then what else in history has been shaped the same way? And now, as we near the end of our journey, the final truth approaches like a storm on the horizon. Set was buried, erased, demonized, and yet impossibly he endures. In forgotten prayers, in secret symbols, in the red wind that still howls beyond the Nile's reach. What Egypt feared most was not that Set would return. It was that he never left. The sun has long since set. The sand has cooled. The desert holds its breath. And in that silence, one name still echoes not from the lips of priests, not from temple hymns or golden scrolls, but from the wind itself. Set. They tried to kill him with stories, tried to erase him with ink and stone, tried to break his legacy across dynasties, across revolutions, across every sacred narrative Egypt ever carved. But some truths are immune to erasure. Some gods do not need temples. Some survive in the gaps. Set was never meant to be safe. He wasn't made to comfort or soothe or bless crops under a golden sun. He was the red flash on the horizon, the unexpected turn, the gust of wind that slams a door and startles the heart, the god of thresholds who guards the edge between what is and what must be left behind. And so he endures. In the fragments unearthed from forgotten tombs, in the misaligned cartouches that whisper of hidden lineages, in the patterns that repeat through Akhenaten, through rebellions, through every moment when the old rules no longer served, and something wild, something true was needed in their place. Set doesn't promise salvation. He never did. What he offers quietly, relentlessly, is the courage to face the storm and not turn away. And perhaps that's why they buried him so deep. Because deep down they knew chaos, when it tells the truth, is more terrifying than any lie.